Hey guys, welcome to this revision video where I will basically run you through everything you need to know about neurons. We're going to go through the structure and function, the basics of what you need to know there, and then we're going to have a little chat about how one neuron sends a message to the other through synaptic transmission. So in the last video we talked about the nervous system, and in the nervous system it is essentially, when you zoom in with a microscope, you'll see it's made up of lots and lots of these things called neurons, which are nerve cells that enable communication within the nervous system. Now, a couple of things you could get asked about a neuron in the exam. Firstly, you could get asked to draw one. So here's an example of a neuron that you would be expected to draw. Most of the time in the exam, they will be referring to a motor neuron. So it would look something like this. Or they could ask you to label the neuron. So over on the left, you've got the dendrite. This is the part of the neuron which receives messages from previous neurons. We've got the soma, which is another name for the cell body. We've got the nucleus, which is where the genetic material is held. We've got the axon, which is the long tail part of the neuron, which takes the message away from the nucleus. Around the axon, we've got the myelin sheath, the insulating layer, which helps speed up the transmission of the message, because we need these messages to fly really quickly. And then at the end, we've got the motor end plates, which attach to the effectors, the muscles, to cause them to basically move. So there are three types of neuron which you could get questioned on in the exam. The first one is the sensory neuron, which essentially attaches to the receptors in your skin. It's part of the peripheral nervous system, and it's got long dendrites and short axons. What its main job is to take messages from the receptor and transfer them up to the central nervous system so that the central nervous system can then interpret them. So essentially, if you're like burning your hand or something sharp is pressing onto your arm, for example, the sensory neuron will pick that message up from the receptor and take it to the central nervous system. The next neuron is the relay neuron. This is essentially the go-between between the sensory and the motor neuron, and it's also the only neuron that's found in the central nervous system, so it's located in the brain and in the spinal cord. This has very short dendrites and very short axons, and it is typically seen as the smallest neuron that we have. Its main job is to transfer electrical messages within the central nervous system, so within the brain, and sometimes it passes the message on from the sensory to the motor neuron. The final neuron is the motor neuron, which attaches from the relay neuron down to the muscles, which we call effectors. It has very short dendrites, but it's got nice long axons, and it is also, like the sensory neuron, part of the peripheral nervous system. Its main role, its main function, is to transfer electrical messages from the central nervous system, from the relay neuron, down to the muscle, again the effector, to basically produce movement. Each neuron, you could get very simple questions like tick box one marked multiple choice questions, where they ask you where the neuron can be found, so within the central nervous system for the relay, for example, or you could get asked about the appearance of it in terms of its long dendrites or short dendrites and its long or short axon. So worth studying and learning this little grid. Now all the neurons essentially work together as a bit of a unit. So the easy example is to imagine that you are putting your hand over a hot flame, and the hot flame will be sort of burning the skin, and the skin will pick that up through the receptors. So the hot flame is the stimulus, and in the hand will be receptors. Now the receptor will pass that message of burning onto the sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron, sort of shown by the red line here in this image, will take that message up to the relay neuron, part of the central nervous system. Now, because we need a quick action here to stop the burning, The relay neuron will quickly pass that message on to the motor neuron, which sends a message down to the muscle there, the bicep, which is the effector, which will cause the response to move the hand out of the way to stop the burning. So that's how the 3 neurons work together. Now, how does a message actually go from one neuron to the next? Well, when you zoom in on the neurons, you will see that they actually don't quite touch each other. There's a very, very small gap between the neurons, and this is called the synapse. And within the synapse, a couple of things you could get asked to do in the exam. One would be to label it. So you can see here on the left, you've got a nice labelled version, or you could get asked to draw that. So you do need to be able to draw that, or you could get asked to be able to describe what happens. So we've got all of those things happening here for you. So firstly, on the left, you've got 2 neurons zoomed right in. This is the dendrite on the right here, and on the left, we've got the synaptic knob of the other neuron. They've got the direction of the impulse coming from left to right. So the electrical impulse comes down the axon, down to the synaptic knob, and then it will essentially cause the vesicles to be stimulated. Once the vesicles are stimulated, the neurotransmitters inside will start to diffuse out of their vesicles, and they will diffuse into the synaptic cleft. Once they're into the synaptic cleft, they will be attracted to the receptors onto the next neuron, which is in the dendrite, and then they will have one of 2 effects. They will either excite that neuron or inhibit that neuron, and once they have done that job, that role that they need to do, they will come out of the receptor and return to their vesicle through a process called reuptake. That's the process of synaptic transmission, and that is one of the simplest ways to put it. Quite a complex, detailed process that's happening in the brain, but also not that bad once you've got it down. When the receptor is filled with neurotransmitters, the neurotransmitters, like we just said, are going to have one of 2 impacts. They're either going to excite or inhibit the next neuron. So if they're going to excite the next neuron, that means we're going to have a positive charge on that neuron, and we're going to increase the likelihood of it firing. If we're going to inhibit the next neuron, that means we're going to bind to the receptor with a negative charge and decrease the likelihood of it firing. Whether it's an excitation or an inhibition will depend on the charge of the neurotransmitters. So if there's more positive charges, it will result in an excitation, make the next neuron fire. If it is a lot of negative charges, it will result in a negative reaction, and a inhibition will occur, and the next neuron will not fire. Right, guys, that's everything about neurons that you need to know, basically. The structure, the function, and how they send one message from one neuron to the next through synaptic transmission.